So the first thing to say is that I am an advocate in the UK Armed Forces for innovation, and it seems to me that innovation, there's a great potential for innovation in the disciplines that I collectively call mil tech. And in coining that term, which I stole from fintech, I mean the disciplines of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, autonomy and robotics, data analysis and visualization, modeling and simulation, behavioral sciences. These all go together, to my mind, under a heading mil-tech, i.e. how might we apply these technologies which are making a big difference in other walks of life in the military sphere. And I think the headline is that from where I sit, even if we wanted to, there isn't a cat's chance in hell of us kind of shutting off this area and saying, none of us are going to go there. That isn't going to happen. What we do need to happen is we think very thoughtfully about the questions that have been so far raised, and I'm sure will come from your questions and answers, and that we therefore regulate and manage the issues in the best possible way to achieve the greatest effect. But the chances of us sitting King Canute-like and resisting the onset of the flow of the tide, I think are zero. These technologies, it's rather like having the idea that we might have looked at the aircraft 100 years ago and said, we're all going to agree that it has no application in warfare. That was never going to happen. So, why is that so? Well, at a headline level, I think we can see a massive impact in the civil sector from these technologies and disciplines. And it's not immediately obvious why those benefits, and I'll come to risks in a minute as well, why those benefits wouldn't be deliverable as well in the military sphere. It isn't a very big leap of faith to see the same kind of benefits in the military space that are now perceivable in the civilian sector. It follows, I think, that we need to think deeply about it. I start from a premise of wanting to make use of these technologies to deliver advantage, but we need to try and think through all the implications of so doing. And I'm honestly of the view that we are only just starting to scratch the surface of this. There are implications to come that we cannot currently see. And what that implies to me is that we must engage in a dialogue. It may change over time. We certainly can't afford to sort of sit around and wait for 15 years while the implications become clear to us. But equally well, we need to be agile and adaptive over time as the full implications of these technologies hit us. The kind of benefits that I see accruing from a military perspective are fairly obvious, I suspect, but I will just mention a couple of them. There is a real potential for the reduction in the consumption of manpower for tasks that can be automated. Since manpower is a premium to greater or lesser degrees for all of us, military manpower, reducing that manpower burden is very attractive. It also obviously reduces our operating costs. It would also reduce our capital costs. Potentially some of these systems may achieve for a fraction of the investment very disproportionate benefit. I said that we would potentially reduce the number of people we need in the military space through these technologies, but it also follows that we potentially reduce the risk to our military people through these technologies. And as a commander of soldiers, why wouldn't I want to be in a position in which the men and women I command are potentially removed from risk, or the risk to them is reduced. So it's very attractive from that perspective. But potentially it also improves the effectiveness of the mission. And here I would say there is a danger of us gliding from the term artificial intelligence to the term, autonomous weapons. Artificial intelligence is going to play a role much wider than in weaponry. And we particularly need to be thoughtful and careful about it in the application of it to weaponry. But it can be really considerable benefit, for example, in understanding. And there is tremendous. You mentioned Project Maven. One of you did. It was you, wasn't it, Elsa? The potential for these technologies to have an impact outside the weaponry space are very considerable and potentially beneficial. But even in the space of platforms, if you are able to operate a drone, for example, you can operate it for longer, you can fly lower, you can fly slower, because you're no longer worrying about putting people at risk, and therefore you can do a better job. So it improves the effectiveness of your mission. Of course, there are also potential risks, and they've been touched on by, I think, all the members of the panel. There is, of course, the potential for illegal use, indiscriminate use, as exists for any weapon system, frankly. But I think it's noteworthy that the UN Special Rapporteur on the protection of human rights whilst engaging in counterterrorism said in 2013 that if used in compliance, and I stress that, if used in compliance, these technologies were capable of reducing the risk of civilian casualties. So I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, but not completely. People sometimes talk about the prohibition of these technologies. I think we should entertain the notion that at some point in the future, the mandation of these technologies, in some respects, may be required, because they may potentially, eventually, be self-evidently more discriminatory rather than less. Another risk that people often talk about is that the operator, by being separate from the machine and not exposed to the same risk, will become divorced from that reality. Essentially, to paraphrase, trigger happy because I'm no longer at risk myself. All I can say there is, that's absolutely not my experience. I have talked to the crews of people who operate the Reaper system in the UK, which is an unmanned air system. They operate very remotely from the battlefield, but they spend long periods of time essentially in the battle space by virtue of observing it. They, unlike actually soldiers like me who might have been involved in conflict where essentially the attack happened, the incident took place, and quite quickly you're moving on and going somewhere else. Very often these crews are responsible for doing the assessment afterwards, so they're very conscious of the effect of what they're doing. And I don't see that danger of divorcing the individual from reality quite so strongly as I think other people do. There is also, the risk of lowering the threshold of conflict. The idea that because you're no longer putting human lives at risk, that you're more willing to engage in conflict. And I do agree that the theoretical possibility of that does exist. Although I think, so far, I don't think we've seen much evidence of that. So, those are the gains, and some of the gains, some of the risks. It's crucial that we mitigate them over time, and so the UK policy is one in which we stress the need for transparency and compliance with the legal, moral, and ethical principles that uphold the legitimacy of the employment of force. For example, Hugo mentioned Article 36 of the Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, which the UK ratified in 1998. It's also our policy that unmanned systems are always under human control, as an absolute guarantee of human oversight, authority, and crucially, as Hugo mentioned, accountability for weapon usage. We don't possess fully autonomous armed weapon systems, and we've no intention of doing so. So in sum, with regard to conflicts, rights and the machine and evolving methods of warfare, which is the title of our panel, the UK Armed Forces are pursuing new data-driven digital capabilities because we believe they offer significant advantage. But we also recognise the necessity to think carefully about these capabilities and to ensure that they are used, that in using them, we remain compliant with our obligations under international law.